What strange and extraordinary things happen to our mind when we get very, very cold? That's the question I'm going to be answering today as I bring you one very curious true story and three related very brilliant books. In 1959, a group of 9 very experienced hikers set off on a 190-mile journey through the Ural Mountains in Russia. There were 7 men and 2 women, and they were all students of the Ural Polytechnical Institute. Now, this wasn't just like a holiday, this wasn't just for fun. This was a really serious, difficult trek. And if they managed to achieve it, they would receive the highest possible hiking certificate in their entire country. They would be hiking heroes, if you like. And they set off on January the 25th on this epic 16-day journey. And as you can see from this map, they travelled by trains and buses until they reached this high, the final inhabited place before they ventured into the bleak and dangerous Ural Mountains. And as you can see from these photographs, the group was in very good spirits. They were really eager to get on with this hike. They were all for it. They were pumped up for it. And you can see they're posing here, both with each other and with the local people in this high. Everything was going fine, everything was on course until they reached a crucial junction in their trek. And this crucial junction was a mountain pass. Now, this pass would eventually, in time, become known as the Dyatlov Pass, named after the leader of this group, Igor Dyatlov. And they camped on one side of the pass because they needed to get through it, they needed to push on. But they thought, we'll camp here, and then in the morning, we'll set off early, hopefully negotiate this pass in a single day, get over to the other side and make camp again. So the next morning, they're all ready, they're all up to start this difficult stretch of the journey. And they set off, and it's fine until this really severe weather storm comes in. The visibility is horrendous. The snowstorms are awful. The temperature is rock bottom, and they're being battered from all directions. So much so that they end up being pushed off course, off this pass that they're supposed to be crossing, onto another mountain pass, a neighbouring one, on a mountain that local people call Death Mountain. Now, it got to the point where they got to set up camp. They couldn't carry on. It was too late. The weather had kind of scuppered any plans they'd got. But instead, and this is a really strange thing, this is the first mystery, instead of going down, away from these terrible winds and temperatures, towards the forest where they could have camped and been sheltered by the trees, they decided to camp on the mountain slope. Now, this has baffled people, since it happened, because these are very experienced people. You think they would automatically do the sensible thing and go down, but it has been suggested that Igor Dyatlov, the leader, didn't want to lose the altitude that they'd gained. So they decided, for whatever reason, that they are going to camp on the mountain slope. So they're on this mountain slope in minus 40-degree temperatures, being absolutely battered by the elements in the middle of this snowstorm. And there we're going to leave them for a moment and go forward in time a little bit, because they were supposed, when they got back to this high, the kind of rural, the inhabited place that they'd set off from, when they finished their hike and got back there, they were supposed to send a telegram to their sports club, to say we're back safely. And Igor Dyatlov said it will definitely be at the absolute latest the 12th of February when I send that telegram. Now, the 12th of February came and went, but nobody was really that worried, because these are very experienced people, and often these hikes, take longer. There are unknown quantities, things happen. So they didn't worry for a little while, but when it got to the 20th of February, they started to worry. And a group of volunteers went out to search for this hiking party. And the volunteers were made up of fellow students and teachers. And off they set. And it wasn't long before they came across the camp that the group of hikers had made on the slope on Death Mountain. And what they found there was really quite horrific. The tent they'd been sleeping in had been slashed open. But it hadn't been slashed open from the outside, it had been slashed open from the inside. So they had used knives to slash the tent to get out of it. And inside the tent, very neatly stacked, was all their cold weather gear and equipment, shoes, jackets, hats, but no sign of the hikers. Then in the snow, away from the tent, there are 9 neat sets of footprints leading down to the forest. Now, on further inspection, it was determined that the hikers who made these footprints, and you can only assume that they were the 9 hikers that were missing, were either barefoot or only wearing 1 shoe. And these were also, very importantly, the footprints of people who were walking calmly. They could tell by the tread and the distance between the steps that the people who had made those footprints were not in any kind of hurry at all. So they had calmly walked from this tent that they'd ripped open from the inside. They'd calmly walked down to the forest, dressed in very little because they'd left all their kind of warm gear back in the tent. And they were all either barefoot or wearing 1 shoe in -40-degree temperatures. Now the searchers follow the footprints and it takes them right to the beginning of the forest, beneath a large cedar tree, where there's evidence of a campfire. And near to the campfire, beside a large rock, there are 2 of the hikers' bodies. You can see from this photograph the outline of where they were found. And these hikers that they found were only wearing their underwear, and they were both barefoot. Now there are no marks or injuries on their bodies other than their hands, which are very raw and scraped on the palms of their hands. And nearby there is a tree, and the tree looks as though somebody's had to try and climb it in a very big hurry, because all of the branches, the bottom branches, were ripped down. So that kind of tied in with the fact that these hikers' hands were all bloodied and raw from trying to climb this tree for whatever reason. Within a few hundred feet of the campfire, searchers found the bodies of 3 other hikers. They were similarly very underdressed, and by their position it looked as though they were trying to make their way back up to the campsite. One of them had a head injury, and the head injury was consistent with being hit on the head very hard again and again and again and again, repeatedly smashing their head. And the other one had a very strange, rectangular, inexplicable bruise on his flank. Now, it was determined that all of these had died of hypothermia, and there was no foul play. Now, there were obviously still 4 hikers unaccounted for, but it wasn't until the following May, when the snows melted, that they could find and search for these 4 missing hikers. And it was the details around these hikers that really ramped up the mystery surrounding what happened to these 9 hikers on the Dyatlov Pass. And that's when this story became something of an urban legend. Now, of the remaining 4, one of them had simply died of hypothermia, no injuries whatsoever. One of them had a skull fracture. One of them had extreme chest fractures, like the power that you would sustain if you were hit by a moving car. So a very powerful force had gone into that hiker and fractured all their ribs and their chest. But the last hiker was the most unfortunate, because not only was their chest caved in, they were also missing their eyes, their tongue, and their lips. And they had a skull fracture, very much like one of the other ones, but a piece of that skull had been taken away and removed and was never found. Now, they weren't as kind of poorly dressed as the other hikers who were just in their underwear. These final 4 weren't dressed appropriately, but they were actually dressed. But they were dressed in each other's clothing, which suggested perhaps that they had died not all at the same time, that they had died one by one, and as they died, the others took the clothing and put it on themselves. And one of the most interesting things is this clothing that they were all wearing had traces of radiation on it. Now, I'm going to show some pictures of the bodies of the hikers. They're in black and white, they're very old, they're not especially graphic, but if you don't like looking at things like that, which is completely understandable, then I would advise you to look away when I show them. I'm going to show them in silence, so when you hear my voice again, you'll know the pictures have gone and you can look back. Okay, the pictures have gone now. What's really striking about those pictures, if you had a look at them, is the look of horror on these people's faces, which was quite horrific to look at. Now the Soviet government were very quick to close this down, unsurprisingly. They said it was incompetence, that it was an inevitable accident, that it was, you know, human error, misadventure, but nobody believed them because it was the Russian government and they have history of making things up. And early on the Soviet people started to come up with theories of their own about what happened to the people on Dyatlov Pass, as it became known. And then the rest of the world joined in because it became a global mystery and everyone had a theory about what had happened. And as I'm talking to you now, there are roughly around 75 different theories of the Dyatlov Pass incident as it became known. And I'm going to look at a handful of the more plausible ones because some of them really are quite bizarre. We will look at the more plausible ones, but first I want to show you 3 books which explore what happens to our minds and our bodies when we get very, very cold. We cannot talk about cold temperatures and people losing their minds without this absolute classic of a novel. It is Stephen King's The Shining. And it tells the tale of Jack Torrance, who is a struggling writer and a recovering alcoholic. And he is given the job of an off-season caretaker for the Overlook Hotel in the Canadian Rockies. And he takes his poor family along for the trip. And when a snowstorm leaves the family stranded and cut off from the rest of the world, the ghostly supernatural forces in the hotel begin to affect Jack's sanity. Whilst the film definitely differs an awful lot from the book, you just cannot forget this. And you cannot forget this either. Seriously scary stuff. It's a brilliant novel. Even if you've seen the film, do read the book because it's very, very different. Book number 2 is Michelle Paver's utterly brilliant Dark Matter, which is set in London in 1937 and involves another Jack. But this time it's Jack Miller, and he's 28 years old and he's bored and he's lonely and he's in a bit of a dead-end job. So he jumps at the chance to join a year-long Arctic expedition working as a radio operator. Now let's just say he begins to regret that decision very quickly and soon sees the joy in lonely, bored and dead end. This is a really scary book. It scared the living bejesus out of me. It's a proper ghost story, and unfortunately you don't get many ghost stories these days. I adored it. If you like something spine-tingling, scary and spooky, then this is your jam. And also Michelle Paver's Thin Air, which is another excellent ghost story and could easily have been included in this episode. And finally, book number 3 is Chloe Benjamin's brilliant Understory, which tells the tale of Laurel Salter, who in the aftermath of a relationship split, takes a job washing dishes for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a remote research centre in Antarctica. However, Laurel is captivated by a strange light which keeps appearing over the ice, and she's convinced that this light could offer her a second chance, a chance to live her story a second time. Now this is out in September. This is a proof and it was very kindly sent to me. It's utterly exquisite and I should be talking about this on Instagram in due course. And if you love books and you love book chat and you want to recommend some books to me and hear what other people have got to recommend, then do join me over on Instagram. My Instagram username is Dr. Jo Cannon. So hop over there, come follow me, and we will exchange book recommendations. So let's get back now to the Ural Mountains and have a look at some of the theories behind what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. Now the first theory is the one that people jumped on immediately because society likes to pick on the weakest people. And they said, well, I think it is the Mansai people, the local indigenous population, the local tribe. They were obviously ticked off because these hikers encroached on their territory, so they ambushed them and murdered them. Now, it would explain perhaps why the hikers were so desperate to get out of their tent, but it wouldn't explain why they then calmly walked down into the forest barefoot. And it wouldn't explain a lot of the injuries that these hikers sustained. They weren't consistent, with an attack or an ambush. And more importantly, the Mansai tribe, the local indigenous population, are not a violent people. They have never been violent. They do not ambush and murder anyone and haven't done so before or since this incident. So that theory is a load of nonsense, to be honest, and it was just a knee-jerk reaction from people who were obviously frightened. Now, the second theory is perhaps a little bit more plausible, and it's perhaps something that you thought of. It's something that I thought of immediately when I first heard the story, and that is maybe it was an avalanche. That would explain why they were in such a rush to get out of the tent. That would explain why some of the injuries were consistent with a kind of car accident injury, in as much as the force that hit someone. But it doesn't explain a lot of things. It doesn't explain some of the other injuries. It doesn't explain why they walked calmly into the forest if there was an avalanche coming towards them. And also there was no evidence of an avalanche anywhere. You know, the tree line wasn't disturbed. Nobody reported an avalanche. The Mansai people, the local people, didn't report an avalanche. There has never been an avalanche in that part of the world, in that particular area, either since or before. So it does not seem likely that an avalanche is the thing that killed these hikers. Now we're going to look at something that is science and that does explain something. And it explains why some of the hikers were underdressed and why some of the hikers weren't dressed at all and were just in their underwear. And it's a thing called paradoxical undressing. And it happens when people are very, very cold. And scientifically, when you're cold, your little blood vessels in your skin contract and try and keep the heat in as best they can. But if you keep getting colder and colder and colder and you start getting to hypothermia, these little blood vessels just get exhausted and they expand because they've just had enough, they can't do anymore. And when they expand like that, there's a rush of warm blood to the skin's surface because the expanded blood vessel lets all the blood through. So your brain then gets very confused and thinks, oh, I'm very, very warm, I must take my clothes off. And you know, instinctively you start undressing because you feel hot. But it's purely because your blood vessels have expanded, you know, through exhaustion, through trying to keep you warm. They've given up, expanded, and all this warm blood has rushed to the skin's surface. And so you start feeling warm, and so you start undressing. And that might be, perhaps, why some of the hikers were not dressed at all and some only had kind of minimal clothing on. But it doesn't explain all the other things. So let's look at two of the less conventional theories that flew around to try and explain what happened to the Dyatlov hikers. The first one is UFOs, because of course UFOs have to be brought into it. UFO theory exists because there were mystery burns on a few of the hikers' bodies and there were scorched trees nearby. And also people in the area reported seeing giant balls of fire in the sky around the time that it happened. But one of the most compelling bits of evidence for the UFO people who believe this theory is this photograph, which was found on one of the hikers' cameras at the very end of the film. But this is a typical image found at the end of a roll of film. And it's connected to when you open the camera to take the roll of film out and the light hits, you know, the final bits of the film in the camera, because it's just the light exposure. So it doesn't look quite as exciting as it first appears. Now the second less conventional theory is Yetis. People are convinced that a Yeti is involved in this situation, and that's also because of the final image on another camera of one of the other hikers, which is this one. And it shows quite a large human-like figure, doesn't it? But it's kind of just out of focus. But they do look quite disproportionately tall, although there's nothing really to give perspective in the picture. And I think if you look at this picture with the word Yeti in your head, then you might think it is a Yeti. But when you look at this picture and think, you know, maybe this is just a picture of one of the hikers, then it doesn't seem quite as exciting as when you first see it. But people do believe it's a Yeti. And there is such thing as a Russian Yeti called a Myunk, which is spelt M-E-N-K, but pronounced, I think, Myunk. And this is an image of a Myunk, which is created by the artist Alessandro Sturiali. And it's really quite terrifying, isn't it? But I don't think a Yeti was involved in this, because what self-respecting Yeti would leave a bunch of dead bodies lying around and not get involved in them? That's the question I'm putting to you. So I don't think Yetis are in any way connected to the Dyatlov incident. Now back to more conventional theories. Something that a lot of people believe, and something that the families of the victims believe, or at least some of them, is that the group stumbled upon some military testing that was going on in the area by the Russian government. This is obviously fueled by the fact there was radiation, trace of radiation found on the clothing of the second group of bodies. There were lots of birds and animals also found dead in the area, and locals are banned from drinking the well water or hunting. As soon as the bodies were found, they were told not to do that. Another thing which backs up this theory is that when the bodies were held in the mortuary, when the bodies were finally found, the second group of bodies, and they were held in the mortuary, the KGB were guarding them, which, you know, perhaps a little OTT, the KGB, why not the local police? But indeed they brought the KGB in, which people thought was a very, very strange move on behalf of the Russian government. And also people who went to the funeral said that the skin of the hikers was very, very discoloured. It was like a reddish brown. But hypothermia does cause discoloration of skin. You know, and if there's military testing going on and a chance of radiation, why was no one else affected? Why only those 9 hikers? Why not the local indigenous population? Why were they not affected? You know, so whilst it might explain the radiation evidence, it doesn't explain a lot of the other things. The Soviet government officially said that the cause of death, and I quote, was a compelling natural force that they were not able to overcome. Isn't that an eerie way of putting it? You know, compelling natural force, avalanche possibly, but a compelling natural force that they were not able to overcome. A little bit wordy, a little bit cryptic. And everyone thought that because nobody would shut up about it. And people continued to debate and come up with different theories. And the Russian government got a little bit tired of it. So in 2019, they said they were going to reopen the case. But there's a catch. They were only going to consider 3 potential theories. And those potential theories were avalanche, hurricane, or a slab of ice. None of this Yeti nonsense. My words, not theirs. But they were the only 3 things that they would be willing to look into. Now, when they reopened the case in 2019, they were very thorough. They visited the site, they took measurements, they did all sorts. They consulted historical records, weather reports, and this is what they came up with. They said that the weather conditions at the time of the Dyatlov Pass incident were far, far worse than we first imagined. They also said their theory is that a slab of ice came cascading down the mountain and either partially hit the tent or narrowly missed it, which obviously would alarm all the hikers in the tent, which is why they ripped their way out. And the hikers, having seen this slab of ice come crashing down, feared that an avalanche was imminent. And so they followed Good Hiking 101, which, you know, the sensible thing is to leave your tent, leave everything, go down the mountain into the forest and seek shelter. So that's what these investigators in 2019 reckon that they did. However, there was no avalanche. The investigation said no avalanche occurred. If they'd not been such good hikers and so professional and they'd stayed with their tent, they probably would have been fine. But because they left it, no avalanche came. They waited and waited and then decided, you know, we've got to get back to our tent. They were hypothermic. They'd barely got any clothes on, or some of them hadn't got appropriate clothes on. So they had to try and get back to the tent in the dark, in these bad conditions, suffering from hypothermia, which causes mental confusion and disorientation. And that's when they got lost, and that's when they all died. And that was the Russian government's conclusion, and the Russian government said, case closed, thank you very much. But whilst the 2019 investigation does seem logical, their findings on the surface, you know, ice slab, fear of an avalanche, which never actually came, but they thought it might, so they left their tent, went down to the forest, got lost, got disorientated, hypothermic, all died. That does sound, you know, logical. But it doesn't explain certain things. It doesn't explain why, if they left their tent in a hurry in fear of their life, those footprints were the footprints of people who were walking very calmly and very slowly down to the forest. You would not walk like that if you believed you were in fear of your life. It also doesn't explain why there's radiation on some of their clothing. And it also doesn't explain why, you know, some of the hikers were shown to have sustained injuries consistent with being hit by a car, that kind of power, that kind of crushed injury. And it doesn't explain why that last hiker had their eyes and lips and tongue removed. Doesn't explain any of that. And the thing with the Dyatlov Pass incident, the reason it's become this kind of urban legend is because not one of these theories goes all the way to explaining everything. Some of them might explain some of it, but within each one there is a loophole, there is a kind of a yes but question which goes unanswered. And perhaps we'll never really truly know what happened to the Dyatlov 9, those students who all perished on Death Mountain. Or perhaps it is that we haven't come up with the right theory yet. I would love to hear your views. Do you think you can solve this puzzle? Do you think you know what happened to them? If so, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please comment below and let me know. I hope you've enjoyed today's curious true story and these 3 brilliant books, which all explore the idea of what happens when our minds and our bodies get far too cold. If you have enjoyed it, please click on the like button. It really does mean a lot to me and it only takes a second. And click on the subscribe button too, because you don't want to miss any future episodes. Next time, I'm going to be discussing a very ordinary British street where many very logical and perfectly rational people have reported going into a shop, and when they come out of that shop a few minutes later, they have travelled back in time. I kid you not. We will be talking about that next Sunday, and 3 brilliant books looking at time slips. So join me then, and in the meantime, have a brilliant week.